as a result of the final transition of Kharkov under Soviet control. A powerful blow was dealt to the southern and central fronts. Through the gaps formed, the enemy's tanks operated, endangering our defences. A general retreat began. The Russians managed to take entire divisions in the ring of encirclement. After our unit was provided with new weapons and combat vehicles, we were often used to repel attacks of the enemy, wedged behind the line of defence. We performed feats, which were then reported in the reports of the command. As soon as the fighters of the Great Germany appeared, the enemy fled. At least that's what the official report said. The fact that we are having a hard time. You bet we are surrounded. The troops are leaving weapons and ammunition and fleeing through the swamps. Of course, it was not reported, nor did the reports tell us how a whole platoon, headed by an adjutant, was captured. It was not released in time, or that we had lost heart. After all, we were to spend another winter in the war, which meant that new bridges of corpses would appear on the ice-covered rivers. Whole regiments would be left to their fate again. Again, shells will turn the earth around, and we will be suffocating with fear somewhere, say near Chernigov. Blisters will again appear on our hands, and we will all resign ourselves to the thought of inevitable death. Many years have passed since then. The generals wrote a lot of memoirs. In them, they dwelled on the tragic fate of the German soldiers. They needed only a few words to report how many had frozen to death or died of disease. But what those who remain alive, those who are among their comrades but realize that no one cares about their suffering, they did not write a line about that. I, at least, have not read anything like that. Not once have I ever come across any mention of the ordinary soldier, the one on whom the chief is angry, the one who is ready to be torn to pieces by the enemy, the soldier before whom an endless succession of deaths passes. And then at the moment of victory comes the most important disappointment. The soldier realizes that even it will not give him back his freedom. All that remains are the crimes committed in the war and contempt for everything done in the years of peace. That's the only reason you go into battle. Our commander, Captain Vesredo, once remarked, "You furious, desperately defending even when ordered to attack. So do not be afraid of anything. For life is war, and war is life. Freedom is a fairy tale for simpletons." In moments of despondency, Captain Vesredo always came to our rescue. He never boasted of his rank. On the contrary, he always emphasized that he was one of us. The captain spent hours together with us in the guardhouse, and sometimes came into the dugout and started a conversation. At such moments we forgot about what was going on around us. And now, in front of me, as if in reality, stands his haggard face. There he sits among the soldiers. The lamp casts an uneven glare on his face. Vesredo was fond of saying, "Germany is a great country. That's why it faces enormous problems. How are we worse than the enemy? We must follow orders, even if we do not agree with them. After all, our country, our comrades, our families are behind us. Half the world is against us. You know what I mean. I've travelled all over the world. I've even been to South Africa and New Zealand. I fought in Spain, then Poland, then France. Now I'm fighting in Russia. Everywhere I've seen the same thing. Even my father taught me to be flexible, and although I have had a lot of troubles, I followed his advice. Often, instead of drawing my sword, I just smiled and told myself that it was my own fault. The first time I encountered war, it was in Spain. I decided to lay hands on myself. I was so sick of what we were doing there. But I saw how the Spaniards behaved. They, too, believed they were fighting for a just cause, and were not ashamed to kill. I have seen how the French, having recovered from fear, took up arms. They began to fight even though it was useless, and we were ready to give them a hand. People don't like change at all. They fear them, hate them, and will fight for what they were protesting against, as long as everything remains the same. A philosopher who has spent his life behind a desk can lead a whole herd by proclaiming that all men are equal. It is clear to a fool that there are more differences between people than between a rooster and a calf, but try to prove it. Everyone has his own beliefs. Everyone is ready to fight for freedom. They start to threaten us, and peaceful existence comes to an end. So the best thing to do is to give the human herd bread and entertainment. People value them much more than any freedom. That is exactly what is happening now with our enemy. We Germans are not as dumb as they are. At least we can look at ourselves from the outside. Of course, we are far from perfect, but we are ready to experiment. We stand for the unity of the German nation. Of course, such an idea is not easy to accept, but the majority of Germans support it and are ready to act together for a great cause. That's where the main risk comes in. We are trying to destroy the old world and revive the old virtues that were buried under the heavy layer of sins committed by our ancestors. It's a thankless task. Everyone is laughing at us. If we lose tomorrow, there will be no mercy. We will be accused of being murderers, as if soldiers have always been doing something other than killing. The ideals we believe in will be ridiculed. No one and nothing will be spared. Our graves will be destroyed. They will leave monuments only to those who, in their hearts, were on the side of the enemy. What heroism and the feats we do every day, our fears and our hopes, the memory of living and dead comrades. All this will be forgotten and posterity will never know the truth. They will think we are fools and sacrificed our lives for the stupidest cause. You have no choice. May your enemies win tomorrow, may the war end and there be peace. But you will have no peace. You will not be forgiven for surviving. You will be looked upon with contempt, or, at best, as if you were a fossilized mammoth. You will always feel like an outsider amongst the others. Is that the fate you wish for yourself? Let those who are tired of fighting and who remain in our ranks out of fear speak to me. I will spare no time to dissuade you. But once again, those who want to leave, let them go. What good are such soldiers? Believe me, I know exactly what you're going through. I, like you, have to endure the cold fear, have to shoot at the enemy. I'm an officer, so I'm expected to do more than you. I don't want to die, even if I have to spend the rest of my life in the war. I want my company to think and act as one man. I will not tolerate doubts and defeatist attitudes during combat. After all, we are fighting not only for victory, but also for life. The enemy wants to wipe us off the face of the earth, and they don't care about our ideas. You must never doubt me. Know that I will not put you in front of bullets. I will burn 100 villages if that's what it takes to feed a single soldier. Here, in the wild steppe, we will truly feel our unity. Everything around us is full of hatred. There is only one thing left for us to do: oppose the undisciplined enemy with our unity and courage. Everyone is obliged to think and act like everyone else. If we succeed, even if we die, we will remain victorious. Conversations with Captain Vesrideau were deeply imprinted on our souls. He spoke with such sincerity that he could convince anyone. How different were his words, coming from the heart, to pompous speeches about the need for self-sacrifice. He was not afraid of questions and always found an answer. Whenever he had a free moment, he would come to us. We simply adored him. In his person, we found a real commander and a true friend, on whom we could rely. He was a threat to the enemy and a father to the soldiers. During combat operations or redeployment, his all-terrain vehicle was always ahead of us. The veteran, who had a good understanding of people, immediately after the battles near Belgorod, while we were licking our wounds in the rear, paid attention to him. "I've seen the captain," he said. "He seems to be far from being a fool." Before we withdrew behind the Dnieper in early fall, we had to endure 2 more battles. Before the battle began, many had to get new weapons. Those who came empty-handed had to make excuses. The Berg, Sudets and Gauls were luckily recognized as wounded and were not required to come with weapons. Of course, even a fool was clear that during the retreat of the soldier is not to arms, but it was assumed that German soldiers should not part with their weapons. They must die with a rifle in their hand. It is true that I, without realizing it, dragged my rifle with me as if a blind man were carrying a stick. The veteran dragged the machine gun. But I lost my helmet, my sleeping bag and gas mask. Somewhere on the road there were machine gun tapes. We met Lenzen. He had survived, but had lost his equipment. The thought that such negligence could cost him his rank made his hair stand on end. The veteran, who also held the rank of Oberrefriator, jokingly said, "Next time you'll have to do the deed. You will be promoted posthumously." Lenzen was out of breath, and we were laughing. The moonshine we had found in the cellar of the abandoned house soon appeared on the table, and our thoughts took a different direction. It was thanks to Vesrideau that we had escaped a court-martial. We were no less afraid of a court-martial than we were of Soviet shells. That's how we spent 3 weeks away from the fighting positions. The weather was glorious. I took advantage of the lull and did nothing but write to Paula. True about the horrors of the Battle of Belgorod, I never dared to tell her. Gals met with a Russian girl. However, it turned out that he is not the only one who enjoys communicating with her. One evening, when he went to see her, he ran into our priest. He had been through as much as we had at Belgorod, and now as compensation he had fallen into carnal transgressions. He had behaved in an exemplary manner before, and therefore he hoped that his present sins would be forgiven. Now, when he opened his mouth to sing a psalm, there was laughter. He blushed and laughed with us. And so it went on. But one day at the end of September, the rumble of the guns coming from afar reminded us that we had not come to Russia to have fun. It turned out that the Russians had broken through the front line, which the German troops had managed to restore west of Belgorod. We found ourselves once again in the vent of a volcano. Our generals, who thought that the troops should, if not go on the attack, then at least hold the front, with great delay realized that the extermination of our soldiers only slightly held back the blows of the Russian army, which led the offensive along the entire central front. Now, what had to be done in lieu of a new march eastward seemed so simple, but at the time it took a long time before the order was given to withdraw to the west bank of the Dnieper. The Dnieper line meant that Kiev was on the central front, Cherkasy to the south and Chernigov to the north, on the Desna. The distance was several hundred kilometers. We were continuously pursued by the enemy, who acted more and more mobile and at any minute could seize our positions. Before Belgorod, something could still be done. Now the situation changed. We would have to pay a huge price in sweat and blood to fight rearguard battles. The late retreat cost the Wehrmacht many more lives than the offensive had taken. We died by the thousands that autumn in the Ukrainian steppe, and how many heroes died in battle without being recognized. Even the stubborn ones realized that it doesn't matter how many hundreds of Russians you kill, how bravely you fight. After all, the next day there will be just as many more, and then another and another. Even a blind man could see that the Russians were driven by desperate heroism, and even the deaths of millions of compatriots would not stop them. It was clear that under such circumstances, the one who has numerical superiority wins. That's why we despaired. And can you blame us for that? We knew we were certain to die. Yes, our deaths would allow troop movements, serve a good purpose. But we did not want to die, so we started to kill everyone indiscriminately, as if in revenge for what was ahead of us. As we died, we realized we'd never been able to get our revenge. And if we survived, we turned into madmen and could no longer live in peace. We tried to escape from reality, but clear orders were like morphine injections for us. On the Dnieper, we were told everything will be easier. The Ivans will not break through the defences. Courage. Do everything to delay them if you want to wait for reinforcements. On the Dnieper, the Russian counter-offensive will collapse and we'll resume our offensive to the east. No matter how panicked and desperate we are, an order is an order. The enemy was amazed at the courage with which ordinary German soldiers fought. We retreated to the Dnieper, each time retreating 100 meters, and delayed the enemy as long as possible. And our comrades were dying around us. Fighting continued for several days along the front for hundreds of kilometers. Those who managed to escape and get to the river were met by a mass of people waiting for a crossing. At the bridges, restored by our sappers, stood whole armies. Soldiers tried to cross the river on any boat. The Russians followed us on our heels, fought throughout the perimeter of the defense, and it was constantly shrinking. Partially we were protected by the Luftwaffe aviation, but soon our planes could not resist the numerical superiority of MiG and Yakov. Those who managed to escape the enemy anti-aircraft fire fought with enemy fighters, which became more and more numerous. Those who could not cross the Dnieper fought. Their chances of survival were 100 to 1. We performed heroic feats, once again proving what German soldiers are capable of. The weather was good, and more than once we were lucky. However, there are victories that cannot be celebrated. After all, you cannot talk about the victory of an army struggling for survival, and yet they were victories. True, they cost us more than the battles we fought as conquerors. On the banks of the river we were fighting not to take a city or a neighborhood, but to avoid disaster. Everyone knew and felt this. There were hours and days when calm reigned, but anxiety and expectation pressed us so hard that we threw ourselves into battle, only to be struck by the red monster that wanted to swallow us up. We managed to avoid total disaster. Army Group Centre made a breakthrough, and the regiments that continued to fight were ordered to retreat. During the night we destroyed everything, leaving only light weapons. Those who fought on the shore were to be transported by ships, provided to move the remnants of our troops to the west. But the soldiers fighting beside the river, plunged in fog, did not wait for their friends. Instead, they were met by Ivanov's machine guns. The Russians were ahead of us, sinking boats, killing sailors. The soldiers threw themselves into the river and tried to swim to the other bank, leaving their weapons behind. The Russians were shooting at the heads sticking out of the water as if they were targets in a shooting gallery. Some of the soldiers may have managed to swim to shore. Some of the soldiers managed to get on the ships that came up later, which were fired at from the shore and from the sky. Some of the ships were surrounded by enemy gunboats. The soldiers in them fought to the last. Most of them died. The Russians took no prisoners. We hoped that we would be safe on the western bank of the Dnieper and create a new front. We built fortifications and prepared to stay there for a long time. This time the Ivans would not break through. It snowed. We began to build dugouts, reorganize and wait. But among the soldiers the news spread with the speed of a Russian rocket. The officers tried every way to hide what was happening. But reality was too strong. It broke down the barriers of secrecy, and with them our fragile dreams. From Cherkasy in the east, and from the Dnieper in the west, the Red Army was coming at us. In the north, the Russians crossed the Desna. A huge number of soldiers died at the confluence of the Desna and the Dnieper. Winter came. Snowfall instilled despair in us. We were exhausted and there was no respite. How much longer could we retreat? Where to? To Pripyat? To the Bug? To the Oder? The veteran grinned. But is it possible? From these lines, you can understand the situation in which we found ourselves. I am not trying to restore the chronology and geography of the Russian-German War. It is important for me to give an idea of the difficulties we faced. I never knew where our troops were moving, where the centre of fighting was, and I will not be able to outline the front in every period of the war. That is a matter for former staffs. I can only describe individual events, but in minute detail. Even the smell evokes tragic memories in me, and I immerse myself in them, forgetting about the present. I have learned the meaning of the word courage on my own skin. Days and nights of humility and despair, the fear you fight even though your brain is no longer working, the frozen ground lying on which you feel chilled to the bone, the scream of an unfamiliar soldier in a neighbouring trench. You start praying to all the saints, even if you don't believe in God. To describe exactly this is my task, even if I have to plunge back into nightmarish memories. After all, that's what I set out to do. To bring to life the moans coming from the slaughterhouse. People like to learn about war without the slightest discomfort. They read about Verdun or Stalingrad in a comfortable armchair, with their legs stretched out by the fireplace, ready to go back to their normal activities the next day. In fact, you are lucky if you don't have to describe these events in a letter to your family, sitting in a dirty trench. You should read about the war when you are facing problems. And remember that no peacetime worries are worth the grey hairs. Only an idiot would worry about a paycheck. War should be read about during insomnia, when you're too damn tired, or at dawn, as I'm writing about it now, after an asthma attack. Those who, after reading about Verdun or Stalingrad, share their theories with friends over coffee, have understood nothing. Those who read about the battles with a silent smile consider themselves lucky. After all, they remained alive. I continue the story of our life, how we began to come to our senses, although in the distance already heard the rumble of guns. A little bit of everything, grumbled the Sudetes. For 24 hours, the troop transports had been bringing us reinforcements. Each village hut had become a temporary headquarters for the officers who were deciding what would happen to those they were leading into battle. The soldiers themselves waited patiently, huddled around the guns, which were 10 times more numerous than the houses. We were kicked out of our apartments. We waited under the branches of trees at the edge of the village. There our entire company was gathered, lined up in battle order. Weapons were loaded into civilian vehicles. The wind was blowing across the dry steppe, clouds of dust rising on the horizon. They just threw us out, the veteran said to the drunken man named Württemberg. But we didn't leave them anything, just empty bottles. He waved at the new arrivals who threw us out of the huts. I packed the moonshine left under the seat of the truck. Good for you, Württemberg, the skinny paratrooper bellowed. Yes, moonshine is for us, for the elite units. Let the rest of us drink water from a tub. I have a new friend, my age, who spoke good French. Golan Grauer, that was his name, had studied in France in the 41st year. At the age of 16, he was overwhelmed with the desire to become a military man. He volunteered for the army. He was taken with the promise of a future opportunity to continue his studies. With marched, stamping his step, and sang. With my people, I am everywhere. Then he went through the war in Poland and over vast stretches of Russia and visited Belgorod. Now he sits and ponders peace and war. Like me, he dreamed of becoming a famous aviator flying a Junkers 87. Like me, all that remained of that dream were the huge birds whose cries came from the sky. We had little in common in ordinary life, but the failed dream brightened our relation. I hardly saw Gales these days. He was absorbed in the girl who was helping him forget the war. Gales shared with me what was troubling him. If Captain Vesrideau doesn't allow Amy to go with him, the Reds will kill her. That can't happen. I understand, but what can be done here? I replied. Our naivete struck Wartenberg and the veteran. They laughed. If everyone in the company will take the girls with whom they sleep, the cars for the entire division will not be enough. Don't you realize that's not what this is about? Wipe your tears. There'll be time to do the same thing somewhere else. You're just thick-skinned. Many jokes were made about it, but Gales didn't find them witty. You're in love with her, Gales. I knew very well what the word in love meant. Grauer had the same experience in love affairs that I had. Gales calmed down a bit. Let's go for a walk. He put his arm around our shoulders. At least we can talk to you two like human beings. We stepped back and he revealed what was bothering him. Gales had fallen head over heels in love, so much so that he couldn't love anyone else. He insisted on the latter. As much as I'd assured myself before that I wouldn't tell anyone about Paula, I immediately told Gales and Grauer. So that's why you had that look on your face at the end of your vacation, said Gales. Why didn't you tell me? I would have understood. We had a long discussion about our love troubles. Gales said that I was lucky. At least you'll see her again, he said. We watched the twilight fade and the stars appear in the sky. At dawn, the company set out on the road, westward. In the afternoon, we watched an air battle, and Grauer and I remembered how we wanted to enter the Luftwaffe. Messerschmitt 109 came out victorious. 7 or 8 Yarks crashed to the ground, scattered with fireworks. By noon, we reached a strategically important base. Here there was a regrouping of 30 companies, among them ours. The result was a large motorized formation. Right at first time, we were given double-sided clothing, white on one side and camouflage-coloured on the other. We were examined by doctors, which we did not expect. We were also given a supply of food. Our autonomous detachment was commanded by a tank colonel. The supply of armoured troops pleasantly surprised us. Drivers and mechanics inspected the vehicles for the last time and prepared to go on the road. Engines roared. Tanks rumbled. From the outside, you could think that the auto racing began. 2 hours later, the order came to move out. Me and Gales, Grauer and other old friends climbed into a brand-new truck. It had wheels in the front and tracks in the back. We got to the woods at the edge of the airfield. Everything was going fine. We were hampered only by the dust rising from the road. The filters installed on the new cars, sometimes so large that the hood could not be closed, helped little. We stopped for a break in the shade. We shook out our dust-greyed uniforms. Though we had travelled only a little, the dust had gotten everywhere, and most of all it was in our mouths. Damn country, someone muttered. It is impossible to live here even in the fall. Another regiment of the same number joined us. We positioned ourselves along a large shrubbery. Miss Rideau was conferring with other officers at the radio operator's truck. It was covered with camouflage netting so that the vehicle could not be distinguished from the foliage. Pieces of cloth fluttered naturally in the wind. We became a powerful, well-organized unit. In our 2 regiments were collected 6,000 to 7,000 soldiers, about 100 tanks, the same number of machine guns and several mobile workshops. In addition, we had at our disposal 3 companies of motorcyclists, which were to conduct reconnaissance before the battle. During this period, the main armament was concentrated in motorized units, which in turn supported poorly equipped infantry units. Still, our position in the new unit raised our morale, which since the fighting near Belgorod had fallen dramatically. Many wonders had gained their self-confidence. Only one Gales suffered. He had to abandon Amy, giving her a terrible fate. He was inconsolable. Yes, during the war, soldiers have to be castrated. Then guys like Goals won't be looking for trouble on their arse, Württemberg grumbled. Have you ever seen eunuchs fight? But geldings, the chaplain remarked, are as strong as ordinary horses. But we knew our Holy Father too well. He was no more capable of something like this than we were. As darkness fell, our armoured column took to the road. I understood now what an impression the long tank columns of German troops had made at the beginning of the war. During the invasion, the tanks rumbled to speed and overtook the trucks. We drove on, and meanwhile it was getting darker and darker. The rumble of the vehicles could be heard from afar. The soldiers, as always, did not know where they were being led. But for us, the trek was a sign that things were getting better. We felt strong, and we were strong. We could not even imagine what kind of retreat was going on the central front from Smolensk to Kharkov. The speed of our movement was determined by the speed of the trucks. However, on the whole, the picture was quite different. Many regiments were retreating on foot, forcing their way among the superior enemy forces. The troops were deprived even of horses, with the help of which a year ago we pulled heavy vehicles through the snow. Almost all the horses died in winter. There was a shortage of fuel. The trucks, which were in excellent condition, were burned as long as they did not fall to the enemy, and the infantry had to tread in crumbling boots. The Russians knew perfectly well what was happening to us, and spared no pains to weaken the strength of the army as much as possible. All resources were placed at the disposal of units that had undergone complete reorganization. These units were sent to places where the situation was particularly desperate. This was the case with our unit, and we thought that the step was ours again. The main difficulty was the impossibility of full-fledged logistics. At dawn, the armoured army stopped. Both men and vehicles were covered with mud. We reached a huge forest that stretched far to the east as far as the eye could see. We were given 2 hours' rest, which we did not fail to take advantage of, but were awakened before we could sleep. The weather was beautiful. A soft, cool breeze was blowing. Everything seemed so peaceful. We jumped back into the trucks. By noon, our motorcycle scouts returned. Short orders were given, and soon the squad turned toward the village. From there came the crackle of machine guns, and 15 Tigers began to shell the village. The order came to prepare for battle. We threw ourselves on the ground, regretting that we had to break the tranquility of such a beautiful day. But there was nothing to do. The tanks marched through the village, and soon it was all in flames. The Russian artillery opened fire, which we did not realize we had. Several detachments were sent to finish off the artillerymen. In 20 minutes they returned, leading a column of 200 or 300 Russian prisoners of war in front of them. The tanks marched through the burned-out village, firing at what had not yet been destroyed. The whole operation took no more than 45 minutes. A signal sounded. We returned to the spot and moved on again. Toward evening we took 2 advanced Soviet positions. The Russians did not expect our appearance and surrendered almost without a fight. On the second day of the journey we arrived in Konotop. Our regiments were marching southwest towards the powerful Russian army. In the town we refueled. The commissariat officers were horrified. After all, we had taken the gasoline they had prepared for their escape. Not 20 minutes later, we fought with the advanced detachments of the Russians, who suddenly attacked us. Tanks joined the fight, but soon the order to retreat was given. We spent the rest of the day on the road. We reached the place where, according to the plan, we were to receive new supplies. We arrived at the warehouse a few minutes before the sappers blew it up. Cauldrons, drinks, assorted food were about to go up in the air. We stuffed our pockets and cars with everything we could get our hands on, but we couldn't save much. We had enough to feed an entire division for several days, and there's a need for this food somewhere. Tears came to Galza's eyes. He filled his stomach to the brim. And all of us looked with regret at the destruction of the warehouse, not stopping to smoke cigars. At least we got them. We rested and set off again. In the meantime, the Red Army had taken Konotop. The German troops were retreating. Our company crashed into the left flank of the advancing Russian troops. Tanks managed to break through the enemy reserve zone. The enemy scattered, preventing us from opening fire from the guns. That evening, however, the Russians turned back and concentrated their efforts on us. German tanks set 6 Russian tanks on fire. The guns finally started firing. For the first time, I saw German rocket launchers in action. Ours and 2 other companies under Captain Vesrideau were defending the left flank of the armoured formation. Some climbed on the armour of the tanks, the rest of us weaved behind the vehicles, moving at a pedestrian speed. When soldiers think they have seized the initiative, they are ready to go against a far superior enemy. In the last 2 days, our tanks have not been stopped by anyone. we decided we could do anything. 3 companies, squads of 30 men each, crept through the bushes on a cold night. The rumble of engines could be heard nearby. It gave us confidence, and the Russians coming towards us must have been frightened. Shots were also heard. So we walked for about 3 kilometers. Suddenly everything flashed around, and all 800 men as one threw themselves to the ground. Steel helmets reflected the flashes as well as a mirror. The tanks immediately took cover behind the bushes, and their muzzles turned in search of the enemy. We gathered our courage and prepared to fire Russian grenade launchers. Rings at 2 purple flashes. The signal to attack. After a little hesitation, we crawled forward. Some of us even stood up. Most of the Russian flares went out, and we took advantage of the break to dash. I reached a ravine with low shrubbery growing on its edge. 2 more soldiers came up alongside me. Their intermittent breathing gave away our nervous tension. When you wander through the forest at night, you expect that you are about to hit a bush. Fire will break out, and a piece of shrapnel will hit you. It was absolutely impossible to go quietly, and for a Russian sniper at any moment could present a great opportunity. But there was silence. The enemy, who was very close by, decided to take cover and keep us under stress longer. We slowly and cautiously continued the offensive. My temples were pounding, and I tensed up, ready to break away at any second. 20 or 30 meters to the left we heard the sound of voices, and we threw ourselves into the tall grass, saying goodbye to our lives. I rested the butt of my rifle against my shoulder and closed my eyes, ready to shoot. But nothing happened. On the left, where the sound came from, 2 Russians surrendered to our soldiers. We did not understand anything. What is going on in their heads? After all, we can only speculate. Maybe they thought they were cut off from the main forces and got scared. At that time, when the spirit of revenge was so strong, the Russians feared us as much as we feared them. We even thought at first that we were being lured into a trap. An hour passed before we were able to regroup. That's when our tanks entered the battle, and we quietly withdrew, loaded on cars, and drove off again. Scouts on motorcycles accompanied the heavy vehicles. In front, about 3 kilometers away, the tanks pushed back the enemy almost without resistance. It was then that dawn came and the first rays of light fell on a column, stretching for 500 meters. The forward units had been shelling all night. Ahead behind the fog could be seen a town, the name of which I no longer remember. Motorized units of Greater Germany fought street battles there. Soon, too, we entered the town. The shutters were tightly closed. We drove slowly through the streets. On both sides were soldiers with rifles in their hands, ready for any surprises. We reached the square. Here stood several cars, and up to 30 Russian inhabitants were huddled under guard. Everything around was burning. For a few minutes we stopped. There was no sidewalk. The houses stood as they were. Like any suburb of countless Russian towns, it looked like a huge cattle yard. The villages lost in the wild steppe, with their huts turned to the north, seemed much prettier. The suburbs of the cities were dreary. We halted to wash and stock up on water. Some hung their clothes on the branches of trees, others poured water from troughs, despite the cold weather and the nasty wind. Most of all, we were thirsty. The water flasks were small, and we took a supply, pouring it into any utensil that came to hand. Following the veteran, we climbed over the fence, beyond which was a garden. From the branches of the nearest tree hung unripe pears, which we ate with pleasure. A Russian appeared out of nowhere. In his hands he had a basket with pears. With a tortured smile, he said something to the veteran, without taking his eyes off his holster. Come on, the veteran said in Russian, holding out his hand. The man handed over the basket, and the veteran took a pear from it. After tasting it, he spat it out and took another, and each suffered the same fate. This was repeated 5 or 6 times. Then the veteran began to shout at the Russian. He stepped back. "They are rotten," the veteran growled, coming back to us. Hoping to save the garden, the Russian gave us the fruit he had left for the pigs. As soon as we realized this, we shook the tree vigorously. The Russian withdrew. In the northwest, the guns rumbled. Our advanced units were engaged with the enemy. Continuing on our way, after half an hour, we got out of the trucks again. Fieldfell's whistle called to prepare for battle. It was already simmering 2 kilometers away, in a small village near the factory. Tanutrila briefly explained our tower, to neutralize the large enemy units holding the village. To fulfill the task were sent 2 companies. The rest continued to move. We went to the village, where the rocket launchers and anti-tank guns had already been pulled. The Russians, who were watching us from the trenches, immediately fired shells at us. If they had taken better aim, we would have all been killed. We rushed for cover. Our 2 companies split up and partially surrounded the Russian trenches. We then waited 10 minutes while the captain discussed the coming operation with his subordinates. The officers returned to us and named the positions to be taken. While they were explaining, we looked around, searching for any place where the enemy might be hiding. But all was quiet, and the task set before us seemed childish. Nothing moved. Only the noise of armoured units moving away along the road was heard. The Russians were quiet. Many even thought that they were already finished with them. Forward, from cover, ducked down, came out soldiers. There was laughter. What was that? A game or bravado? The soldiers reached the first huts. Still quiet, no one in sight. I joined my platoon. Gals was there. We exchanged glances with him, which said much more than a long conversation. Things would be different now, we thought. The battles on the Don and the retreat from Belgorod were in the past. It would not happen again. We knew, of course, that the war was not over yet, but during the last week the enemy kept retreating. Soldiers were making their way through the ruins, 5 or 6 tankers among them. One of them threw a grenade through an open window. A second later there was an explosion in the air, and then a groan, of which we had heard many. A Russian woman in white jumped out of the window, got up and, screaming, ran towards us. One of the soldiers raised his rifle, and it seemed to us that it went off, but the woman kept running. No one uttered a word. For a second the war stopped. Grenadiers kicked the door open and rushed into the house. 3 more civilians came in, and a child. The Russians didn't remove the civilians from the village. We will have to take into account that there are civilians left here. Vesredo realized this. From the loudspeaker mounted on the half-track vehicle came a few words in Russian. Probably the Russians were being given the opportunity to lay down their arms. But the vehicle had gone only 100 meters when tragedy struck. Suddenly the car flew into the air and several deafening explosions sounded in the air. The nearest huts exploded. The village disappeared from our eyes under clouds of dust and smoke. 2 charred figures jumped out of the burning car. "Look out for mines," someone shouted. But his voice was drowned out by the rumble of howitzers. Geysers of fire rose up ahead. Roofs flew from the houses. The Russians immediately reacted to the shelling. They opened fire from 2 batteries of heavy howitzers. A shell exploded 150 meters away from us and shook the ground. Despite the fact that the surrounding area was full of mines, the signal to attack sounded. We ran out of cover and rushed to the nearest hill. The anti-aircraft guns were firing ahead. The Russians were shelling everything around them from multi-barrel machine guns mounted on trucks. 15 minutes ago, everything had seemed so simple. Now the situation had changed radically. It was as if our confidence was gone. There were 5 of us hiding among the bricks in the ruins. Each explosion buried us deeper into the mud. From the direction of another pile of bricks, we could hear the shout of a field sergeant. He was ordering us to fire at anything we saw. However, even the bravest among us did not raise their heads. Only anti-aircraft and jet guns did not interrupt the enemy's fire. But the one so far had the advantage. 30 meters away from us killed 5 soldiers, huddled behind a small shed. The last 2 survivors didn't know where to run to and were desperately awaiting their fate. Eventually they threw themselves to the ground among the corpses of their comrades. Blood trickled down. The grey dust absorbed it like a blotter. On the left, several barns caught fire at once. Smoke was rising high into the sky. The fire was growing at an amazing rate. Even we were getting hot. Someone ran out of there in a hurry. The nearby huts caught fire. Russians, both civilian and military, rushed out of the burning houses. We shot them like rabbits. Our shell must have hit a fuel depot. The Russians paid dearly for concentrating so many men near it. The enemy fled. It was left to us to deal with those who escaped. From time to time, the silhouette of a Russian appeared in front of the sight of my rifle. A pull of the trigger, a cloud of smoke, and I was looking for a new victim. Will I be forgiven? Am I guilty? There in front of me is a wounded young man. For a few seconds he froze in front of me, and then he rushed away. But it was too late. His face turned grey. He grabbed his chest with both hands and fell face down on the ground. Will I be forgiven? Will I be able to forget this? Fear turning into unbridled courage. makes innocent young men commit real crimes. For us, as for the Russians, everything that moved became a danger. We were seized by the desire to kill, which cost the lives of our soldiers who rushed in pursuit of the enemy. Our large-caliber guns were shooting the outskirts of the village, where the Russian artillery was located. Unburned still huts, we took one after another, ran as hard as we could on the ground, which could be mined, but nothing stopped us. Gals broke into a stable and shot 2 Russians who were desperately trying to revive their machine gun. Nothing stopped the 8th and 13th companies of German infantry that covered themselves with glory. In the bulletins then reportee was, "This morning, after hard fighting, our troops took such and such a town." Our devilish offensive continued, despite the screams of Ifluto Württemberg clutching his stomach, from which blood flowed. As we made our way toward the factory, several more of our boys were killed. At this point, the German gunfire stopped. There was a danger of hitting our own. The Russians did not want to cede an inch of ground and fought desperately for the area surrounding the factory. I don't remember exactly what happened. My platoon joined the veterans guys who had set up for a break in the cement cellar. We drained our flasks but never quenched our thirst. Everyone was covered in mud. The radio operator was sitting next to us. He called the company commander, Captain Vesredo. The fighting subsided slightly. German troops were regrouping, preparing for a decisive offensive. At the disposal of the veterans platoon was an anti-aircraft gun and 2 machine guns. Our platoon had machine guns and rifles. The sergeant positioned us along the cistern and indicated the positions we should take during the attack. The hardest part was getting through the minutes of waiting. Suddenly the Russians appeared. They were making their way through the scaffolding. In his hand, one of them carried a white flag. There were at least 60 of them, not soldiers, but probably factory workers or partisans. They approached us and began to negotiate. The veteran spoke excellent Russian and talked to the prisoners about something. Then the soldiers took them aside. There was a strange calm when it seemed that friendly words exchanged between the opponents could end the violence. We sat down and drank. But we didn't think about it, didn't realize how difficult it was to take the step these people had decided to take. Even those who strove to survive and understood how difficult it was for our opponents did not take their eyes off the factory. Soon we would have to attack it. Animals have a much stronger survival instinct than humans. They run from fire. But we, the chosen ones, the kings of nature, stubbornly march forward like moths striving for a candle. It's called courage, which I lack. Fear gripped my throat. I felt like a sheep on the doorstep of a slaughterhouse. I don't think I was the only one who felt that way. A soldier with a blackened face standing nearby muttered, "We should have surrendered." But what did it matter how we felt? The telephone rang. An order sounded, "Platoon, forward. First, second, count to 1. First, second, I first. Second, I became the first and therefore could stay in the cement shelter, which for me at that moment was better than any palace. After all, death was raging outside. I suppressed a smile. I wondered if the paramedic would notice and send me into battle. In my mind, I thanked God, Allah, Buddha, heaven, earth, water, fire, trees, whatever I could think of. After all, I am staying in the basement, which will be my cover. The soldier next to me was number 2. He looked at me desperately, but I stubbornly looked past him so he wouldn't notice my joy. I looked at the factory as if I should be the one to make this throw, as if number 2 had fallen to me. But my neighbour will go to check the factory. Felfelbel gave a sign, and the neighbour with the others came out of the shelter. Immediately Russian machine guns rang out. Before hiding at the bottom of the shelter, I saw the bullets kicking up fountains of dust along the path of the fleeing soldiers. The bursts of guns and grenades drowned out the cries of the wounded. "Attention. Number 2. Forward!" rushed forward veteran, who did not part with his machine gun. And now it was my turn. The ground was rising all around, and for some reason I started thinking about numbers. Usually people start counting with 1. Why did the second go ahead this time? But the question hung in the air. I didn't have time to think of an answer when the order came. Number 1. Forward, let's go. After a second's hesitation, I jumped out of the shelter like a devil out of a box. All around was darkness. The swirling dust shrouded everything in a fog in which only the bursts of shells flashed. I ran to the foundation of the barn. There lay a dead German soldier. His eyes were fixed on the open breech of a machine gun. It was strange. How often people die so unnoticed. 2 years ago, when I saw a woman run over by a milk barrel, I almost fainted. After spending almost 2 years in Russia, I stopped noticing death. The tragic began to seem small and insignificant. 25 meters away, several trucks exploded one after another. 4 or 5 fleeing soldiers died. Russians or Germans? Who could tell? I and 2 comrades found ourselves in an open shelter made of dirty boards. The Russians had built it to set up a machine gun. We were sitting almost on the corpses of 4 Ivans killed by a grenade explosion. I hit them in one fell swoop, boasted a young soldier from Great Germany. Anti-aircraft fire forced us to cover ourselves with corpses. A shell hit the edge of the dugout. Earth and boards fell on our heads. It hit a soldier squeezed into a lump between me and a dead Russian. He twitched, and I was going to run. Another shell hit the dugout, and the explosion threw me against the opposite wall. I thought I had broken my legs and, afraid to move, only called longingly for help. My pants were torn, but there seemed to be no wounds on the skin beneath them. I again took cover between the corpses of the Russians and fell upon the wounded soldier. We were lying side by side, our heads touching each other, and shrapnel was falling all around us. "My whole back is burning," he moaned. "Tell them to get a stretcher." I glanced at him and shouted, "Ben." Certain but 2 machine guns firing nearby drowned out my shouts. The big man from the Great Germany urged us to advance. "Come on, guys. Someone has already reached the water caserne." I looked at the wounded man. He grabbed my sleeve and looked at me with a pleading look in his eyes. I didn't know how to explain to him that I couldn't help him. The big man jumped out of the shelter. I pulled away sharply and turned my head. The wounded man was still calling for me, but I had already jumped out of the dugout and ran after the soldier. He was 15 meters ahead of me. I found myself with the soldiers of the firing platoon, who were frantically installing 2 anti-aircraft guns. I helped them as much as I could. An infantryman with a bloodied face said the Russians had taken cover in the center turret. A veteran, whom I only now noticed, roared, "Now they're kaput." His face, covered with a layer of dirt, was illuminated by a bright flash. The tower was engulfed in smoke. The Russians couldn't withstand the shelling. Our companies had finished off the last pockets of resistance. Now only sporadic gunfire could be heard. We rushed into the ruins of the factory. It was a victory, but it didn't bring much joy. Unable to regain consciousness, we wandered among the ruins. The infantryman did not hesitate to pick up a sign on which something was written in Cyrillic, maybe a signpost, maybe the word restroom. The city passed into our hands. We captured 300 wounded, and at least 200 enemy soldiers parted with their lives. On the outskirts of the city, Captain Vesrideau lined up his companies and called roll call. We were short 60 men. Golan Grauer had his eye out. After collecting 15 wounded men, we waited for the orderlies to arrive. It wasn't easy to find water. We had to dip buckets into a well in the ruins of a hut. The water was covered with soot. The wounded were moaning in pain. Many were delirious. 75 Russians were also wounded. What was to be done with them? In principle, we were supposed to help them. But orders required us to rejoin the division as soon as we finished the operation, so we abandoned the Russian wounded, and ours were loaded onto carriages and tractors that did not resemble ambulances at all. There was also a problem with the prisoners. There were 50 of them. Our cars were already packed to capacity. Theoretically, the wounded and prisoners should be carried by ammunition and fuel cars as they were relieved of their cargo. But there were already at least 1,000 prisoners in the division. What to do with them? The Germans and Russians climbed on anything that was able to move. We cast a last glance at the town. A thick smoke was rising above it. Clouds thickened in the sky. Soon the rain would wash over the graves of 40 German soldiers sacrificed to suppress the pockets of enemy resistance, which we did not even begin to hold. We were preparing for another operation, not because we were driven by the desire for conquest. It was simply necessary to cover the mass of retreating troops who were withdrawing to the western bank of the Dnieper. Nobody was smiling. We knew that our victory would have no effect on the outcome of the war. We only hoped that it had at least some strategic importance. And the fighting itself brought only one thing: unbelievable fear and incurable injuries. A young blonde soldier, sitting next to the driver of a car with 30 people in it, began to play the harmonica, in our ears, which had almost lost the ability to hear, a beautiful melody sound. We're with you, Lily Marlene, we're with you, Lily Marlene. A slow melody filled with longing. Giles listened. His mouth was ajar, but he was silent and only stared into the void. We rode for an hour, which meant we had travelled 50 kilometres. At last it became dark. All of us longed to stop and clean ourselves from the mud that covered us from head to toe. All of us were tired and wanted to sleep. Of course, no one would refuse a comfortable bed in a warm barracks, but any place where we could stretch out and not think about anything suited us. We knew that if we stopped, we would all throw ourselves on the grass and fall asleep. The sky darkened with clouds. A thunderstorm began, and it rained. We had cursed the rain before, but now we were glad of it. It washed the dirt off our faces. Soon whole streams of water poured down on us. Providence was making a gift of both friends and foes. The uniforms, ours grey-green and the Russians, light brown, stuck to our bodies. We laughed at each other like players from two teams meeting in the shower after a game. We stopped even feeling hatred and the desire for revenge. Fatigue prevailed. So we had to build a shelter. We covered our shoulders and heads with raincoats. Almost no one understood Russian, but we laughed and exchanged smokes. Hanoverian tobacco for Makorka from the Tater steppe. We laughed and laughed just for fun, but we experienced the most incredible joy available to people. Change of tobacco, the smoke wafting from under our cloaks, which made us cough. The unrestrained laughter. All this became a tiny island of joy in a sea of tragedies. We forgot the enmity that had divided us, and the ability to enjoy life returned to us. Suddenly, a terrible thought occurred to me. Would we have to shoot our Russian companions tomorrow? But that's impossible. It can't be that this will continue. We were overtaken by a motorized regiment, which had also halted in the middle of the valley. Raindrops glistened on the motorcycles, covered by the foliage of trees. Wesrideau headed toward the regimental commander. The motorcyclists were wearing long storm jackets that protected them from the rain. However, all their belongings needed for the camp were in the trucks of the provision column, so they did not have to sleep. A rotten sausage for each soldier and slices of bread, which had to be divided among the 8 of them. There was no food for the prisoners. Theoretically, they were to be fed by the division. We wanted to stand aside and there to dispose of the food, but we had to sit together. It was impossible to hide the food. The Russians did not take their eyes off the bread. Finally, we broke it and gave it to these men who had tried to kill us a few hours before. After swallowing the last crumbs of bread, we remained hungry. We were all thirsty, but the flasks had already been drained right after the battle. We got permission to go for a stretch, but no more than that. There were no water barrels nearby. The area was uninhabited. We had to collect water from the leaves of trees. After getting drunk, we set off with a motorcycle regiment. The rain had finally stopped, but every now and then lightning flashed and thunder rumbled. There were other flashes, but they had nothing to do with the storm. It was the guns firing at Konotop. There was a tremendous battle going on there. We hoped to see a roof over our heads for the night. Instead, we had to endure another battle. The face of the blonde-haired guy who had recently played the harmonica had aged 20 years. We arrived in the city dark, deserted. Every now and then flares flew up. The air was thundering. There was a rumble of explosions that blew out glass. It rained again, but not much. There was an order to get out of the trucks. We went after the commanders, and the truck drivers left their cars on the street nearby. My eyes were getting sleepy. Like a robot, I followed the soldier ahead of me and didn't even realize that I was being led back into battle. What happened that night in Konotop? I remember explosions, fires, collapsed houses and dark streets, streams of water and heavy boots that I could barely drag. Swollen feet, the pounding in my temples, a terrible fatigue that bowed me to the ground, the weight of the satchel and cartridge case, and the hostile world. The morning was grey, like the morning of a man sentenced to execution. Sleep had broken me, and I forgot about the nightmare. We lay down on the landing, the roof of which protected us from the rain. Sometimes, however, gusts of wind brought raindrops to us. We slept for several hours. Then we were awakened. Everyone's faces were white and stretched out. Our parents probably wouldn't have recognized us right away. My head was splitting with pain. I lay there wondering what the new day would bring. In front of my eyes was a dilapidated building several stories high, followed by a few miserable shacks that were the shelter of stray cats and soldiers looking for a place to stay. At the far end, the street was blocked with stones. The Russians had shelled the town the night before. I tried to see something else, but then a veteran came up with 2 pots of hot soup. God only knows where he found it. His dirty grey uniform matched the colour of the surrounding background, and his gaunt face beneath the heavy helmet matched his surroundings. I looked at her. The sky was covered with grey clouds. "If you're hungry, you'd better wake up," the veteran said, setting down the wokes. I roused Gales. He jumped up, but realizing that it was not the shelling, gathered himself and, muttering something, straightened up, rubbing his stiff body. "God, I'm so tired of everything," he said. "Where are we and what the hell are we doing here?" "Go eat," said the veteran. We silently devoured the soup, which had already begun to cool. Some of us preferred to sleep some more, but then the order came to go on the road. We went through the destroyed neighbourhood of Conatop. We were so tired that only the bursts of shells or the roar of an airplane made us throw ourselves on the ground. And then we would get up and we would weave again. I felt that I was sick. My head was splitting, my back was aching, I was shaking like in a fever. But what can I do? If it gets really bad, I'll try to ask to go to the hospital. But to do that, I'd have to faint. We found ourselves in a neighbourhood that had been hit the hardest. There was a huge tiger in the rubble. A mine explosion had damaged its right track, but that did not prevent it from sending shells towards the enemy. There might have been Russians in the ruins. We cautiously made our way through the ruins and were finally ordered to halt. Struggling with effort, Gals and I dragged heavy stones to the bottom of the trench to avoid sitting in the water. We looked at each other and were silent. Everything had already been said. The events were unfolding so fast that it could drive you crazy. "You've gotten so sick," said Gales at last. "I'm sick." "We're all sick," said Gales, not taking his eyes off the ruins. For a second our eyes met and I could read the deepest despair in his face. What will happen to us? The thought haunted me. We can't go on like this. We've been living like gypsies for a year now, and that's a weak comparison. Even the poorest gypsies live better. It's been a whole year and I've lost so many friends. Memories came flooding back. The 3rd International Highway, Utini, battalions of soldiers, Ernst, Tempelhof, Berlin, Magdeburg, the horrors of Belgorod, the retreat, and Wartenberg. How was it that fate left me alive? So many deaths passed before my eyes that I didn't know whether it was true or a dream. How did Gals, Lenson, the veteran, other guys from our platoon escape by some miracle? Because we're incredibly lucky to be alive. But all luck comes to an end. Tomorrow they'll bury the veteran, or maybe Hales, or maybe me. I looked around. Yes. Soon it would be my turn. I'll be dead and no one will notice. We're used to it all by now. They'll be sad about me until the next soldier is shot. Tragedies that follow one after another fade quickly from memory. Terror gripped me. My hands trembled. I remembered how horrible the dead looked. I'd seen enough soldiers fall face down in the dirt. They'd stay that way? What about my parents? I need to see them. And Paula. There were tears in my eyes. Gals looked at me, indifferent to suffering, to death, to everything. There's nothing to be done about it. People scream in fear. The dying moan, rivers of blood flow, but the war goes on anyway, and it doesn't care about anything. All we can do is hope. But for what? That we'll get shot and lie face down in the mud? If you give the order, the fighting will stop. After all, people are only people. So I cried and talked to myself. Gales paid no attention to me. "Gales," I said, "we have to get out of here. I'm scared." He looked first at me, then at the horizon. "Where else to go? Go to sleep. You're sick." I was filled with hatred. But Gals is only part of the indifference around him. A tank fired nearby. The Russians responded with 6 shells. There are hardly any buildings left in the city. A mass of wounded and dead. And what if a veteran died? Suddenly everything became unbearable. I wrapped my arms around my head and squeezed it, as if I were trying to crush the despair that had seized me. At last Gales woke up and looked at me with irritation. "No. Sleep, for God's sake. You can't go on like this. Don't you care if I sleep or die? You don't care. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Not even if they shoot you." "That's right. So what?" "What? We got to do something, not just sit around." Gals must have felt the same way I did, but indifference and apathy took over. "I told you to sleep. You're sick." "No." Now I was screaming. "I'd rather be killed and it would be over." I jumped up and crawled out of the shelter. But before I could take 2 steps, Gals grabbed my belt and pulled me back in. "Let go, Gals," I shrieked. "Are you deaf? Let go?" "Shut up, for God's sake, and calm down." He clenched his teeth and put his big arms around my... "You know as well as I do that we're going to get shot, one by one. Leave me alone. What do you care? Don't you care?" "Not at all. Every once in a while I need to see your face, whether it's the face of a veteran or that scumbag Lindbergh. You hear me? You keep whining, I'll slap you upside the head to calm you down. But if a Russian shoots me, I'm dead anyway, and there's nothing you can do about it. I'll weep for you as I did when my little brother Louis died. But you will be shot only when you yourself are shot." I shuddered. Tears streamed down my face. I wanted to kiss my friend on his dirty cheeks. Gales loosened his grip and finally let me go. We both smiled. Late that afternoon, the 3rd attempt at our offensive failed. By this time, the ruins were almost levelled, with only the chimneys sticking out. The darkness was now and then illuminated by the flashes of shells. Another terrible night began. A dark trench, cold water under the stones, fatigue that made me want to die. A night in which nothing important would happen, or maybe the end will come. Shelling and explosions kept us awake anyway. Flares went up in the air. 1,000 memories of youth, so close and so far away, flashed through my mind. Toys so soft like my mom, Paula. That night we never spoke another word, but I knew I had to survive for my friend. The fever seized me long before dawn. Gals wrapped me in a cloak I no longer wanted to unbutton. "Eat this." He handed me the half-emptied jar. "Taste it. You'll feel better." I stared in despair at the jam mixed with the dust from the satchel. "What's this?" "Eat it. It's good. You'll see." I obeyed and picked up the jam with 2 fingers, but before I could swallow half of it, my mouth started to vomit. I threw up, and our hiding place became even dirtier. "Oh, shit," Gal said. "You're sicker than I thought. Try to sleep." Shaking with fever, I sank into the slush and tried to get comfortable enough to sleep. Consciousness did not return to me until several hours later. That same morning we were sent reinforcements. Gals took me to another trench. There was a bed there. 2 soldiers laid me on it. 2 more lay on planks thrown over rocks. Not even fever would let me leave the war. I listened to the rumbling and shook with chills, though I was properly wrapped up. Then someone woke me up and made me swallow a pill. How much time passed, I didn't know. I fought the fever as best I could, and in the meantime the Russians and Germans were fighting on the outskirts of the city. Having pushed the enemy to the east of Konotop, we withdrew. But the enemy was already waiting for us, cutting off communication with the rear. Attempts to break through to the west ended in failure. We found ourselves in a ring that was tightening around us from the north, from the west, and from the south. Our position became hopeless. The officers tried in every way to conceal the fact that we were surrounded. The next day I was ordered to get out of bed and go to the cellar, where it was safer. 50 sick and wounded men were already gathered here. I looked terrible. An orderly put a thermometer in my mouth. The temperature was about 40. I was told to sit in a corner and wait for the morning to be taken care of. The city was under heavy bombardment from both ground and air. The orderlies were knocked off their feet. New wounded were arriving without end. Comrades returned to the line of defence. By noon the orderlies gave me quinine and made me give way to a bleeding soldier. My eyes were double. I waddled down the stairs and out of the cellar. The sun blinded me. There were clouds of smoke everywhere. The lightly wounded were talking. They informed me that we were surrounded. The terrible news was worse than the bombing. Everyone began to worry for themselves, and the officers had to go to the most brutal measures to avoid a disgraceful escape. Encirclement, the situation is hopeless. The Russians are under the city. We are trapped. We hoped that the Luftwaffe would rush to the rescue. But instead of our aviation, we heard the rumble of Yeks and I Love. Russian bombs were destroying what was left of the city. No one knew exactly what was happening. I remember the roll call. Field fells were rounding up everyone. The only way to avoid the battle formation was to lose a leg. The rest of us, including me, had to fight. We were sent with a few bandaged soldiers to the battle area. A new regiment was assembled in a square surrounded by roofless houses. Among the 5 or 6 officers, I immediately recognized Captain Vezrido. Quite nearby, in the northwest, there was the rumble of Stalin's guns. They drowned out our voices and caused a panic that was impossible to cope with. My mouth was bitter, and my gaunt body could hardly stand on its feet. Vesredau spoke. He had to raise his voice because the cannons were rattling so much. Probably he would have preferred to explain everything in detail, but there was no time left. Besides, our 3 companies could be attacked by Russian aviation. But Vesredau said the main thing. Comrades, we are surrounded, the whole division surrounded. Yes, we already knew. But when we heard the news from the mouths of our superiors, we were horrified. If the officers recognized the situation as dangerous. The Russian Katyushas were howling. It confirmed Vesredau's words. We have only one hope, continued the officer, the concentration of troops at one point in the east and a quick breakthrough. We will come forward with the forces of all parts. The success of the operation depends on the courage of everyone. In the battle we'll enter the powerful infantry regiments on the other side of the Russian ring. I know that if everyone does their duty, we will be able to break the encirclement. In the bravery of German soldiers, I do not doubt. Vesredau saluted and ordered to prepare. Companies arrived at the points from which to begin the decisive offensive. Among us were many wounded, who would be better suited to a warm bed than hot fighting. There were some sick ones, like me. The rest of us were tired as hell. They were the ones Vesredau called on to show courage. The brave German soldiers were like old nags being led to the slaughterhouse. Either attack or die. Captivity was out of the question at that time. After suffering a heavy blow, we felt how much we were connected to each other. The last cigarettes and pieces of chocolate, which we usually consumed in secret, appeared. The surroundings were making me homesick. Everything was turning over in my stomach. I was freezing. I looked for a familiar face, but there were only strangers around. My friends must have been assigned to another platoon. They had become brothers to me, and I felt lost without them. I began to dream of a soft bed with silk linen, imitating the veteran. He too liked to talk about such luxuries, which he did not really know. He had never had any luck. But he could dream. Sometimes, stretched out on the hard ground, he smiled, and there was such complacency in his smile that it was clear. The veteran was breaking away from reality. His dream was taking its place. I had not yet been able to train myself in such a way, and no dream drowned out the rattle of the hammers pounding in my temples. Ahead, to the west, the smoke rose so high that it blocked the sky. The horizon was coloured with. The retreating troops had left the wounded in our care, but we had no idea what to do with them. The medics, who were already in short supply, had packed up and left or were about to leave. The wounded were dumped right on the street. They had to stop the blood that flowed from their wounds themselves. We did what we could, but what could we do to help them? There's a fat sergeant coming up. Has left a guy with a shattered knee. He was yelling so much I couldn't take it. Give me somebody to help me. So far, our section hadn't been shelled yet. There was a battle going on right in front of us. Battles were also unfolding to the northwest and southwest. Russian artillery was hitting the area to the north. But when the panting soldiers reached us, the Russians began shelling our positions. The new arrivals scattered, seeking shelter. Cries for help and groans drowned out the bursts. All who could run hid, seeking any shelter. A shaft of fire swept through the 2,000 soldiers, concentrated in the square. The wounded were left lying abandoned in the street, in the mud. The groans of more and more soldiers being thrown to the ground could be heard. The earth shook as at Belgorod. The dirty hands of the sick and wounded, who had resigned themselves to death, began to scrape the ground, and even on the wrinkled faces of the veterans, who had already seen a lot in their lives. Panic was visible very near. Near a pile of bricks, a shell hit the huddled crowd of soldiers. Flesh, bones, and bricks mingled in rivulets of blood. Luck was still with me. I and 3 other soldiers rushed under the stairs in a house left without walls or roof. The basement was littered with broken rafters and shards of slate, but helmets saved our heads. For a moment the rumbling stopped. We heard the groans of the wounded, looked outside, and froze with horror. God bless us, someone shouted. There are rivers of blood. We've got to get out of here, came another, almost frantic shout from a soldier who ran out into the street. He rushed after him. The air was filled with screams. Those who survived were heading west. There is a front there is a breakthrough through which, maybe, it will be possible to escape. They helped everyone who could still stand. The wounded clung to those who ran past. In front of me, 2 soldiers were dragging a wounded man, probably a friend who was dying, through the mud. How much longer would they hold out? When would they leave him? I don't know how much time passed. The Russians were shelling us with 50mm guns. They were aiming at us from all sides. We tried not to leave the wounded behind. In complete disorder, we came to a railroad track on which lay a mangled steam locomotive and several Russian corpses. The tracks led into some sort of trench. We ran along it, passing the second destroyed train. There were our tanks. They were surrounded by officers, soldiers and tankers. Among them was Vesrido. We were given a few minutes of rest. Coming from the southwest, rumbling became even stronger. I felt dizzy. Vesrido and 2 assistants went through the ranks. "Come on up, let's go. Let's move. The division has managed to make a breakthrough. If you don't hurry up, you'll be trapped. So get up. What are you waiting for? We're the last ones here." The soldiers, dying of fatigue, rose to their feet. Feldfebel ordered to leave the wounded brought out of the city. To leave those who can't walk. Now we need only the living. No matter how much the wounded begged for help, we had to leave them to their terrible fate. Paralyzed with fear, they rose to their feet and walked beside us in pain. I lack words to describe the determination and heroism of our soldiers. By overcoming themselves, cowards became heroes, but many managed to walk only half the distance. We broke through the rampart of fire, losing hundreds of soldiers, moving for almost 9 hours from one trench to another, along the Konotop-Kiev road, passing burned tanks and thousands of corpses. Perhaps some of those reading these lines remember the official reports. In the summer of 1943, it was announced that the German troops, surrounded near Konotop, managed to break through the enemy's defense line, but no one said what it cost. For us, however, the day of deliverance was coming.